Tucson there, and those people don't want us just giving Montana or Alaska their money without a butt or two on it. We tried that once under model cities. Butte painted their fire trucks green with their money. I got a kick out of it, but I'm not sure people in Alaska did. There's got to be a but. That's what the federal government ought to do. Yeah, it catches hell for doing it. Watch and see the kind of hell it catches if it doesn't do it. Watch the way those New Yorkers will waste your good Montana money. Yeah. Now, I thought maybe I'd conclude my kind of duality piece here by talking a bit about something that's always troubled me some, and that is the notion of our founders as demigods, not demagogues, demigods, G-O-D-S. I admit they were smart. I believe they were smart because I follow Mr. Jefferson as best I can in his writings, most of which were by letter, and he thought they were a pretty good crowd. So I assume they were. But I do think sometimes we need to get out of the stratosphere and the sainthood that we give to our founders. We treat them as, there's an Alban Hall up here. St. Alban was an Irishman who went to England and did brickwork and prayed a lot, helped people, and they made him a saint. Carroll named a building up here after. And that kind of saint is the way we perceive our founders many times. In fact, there's a major religion in the United States, quite a major religion, that does have the founders as saints. It's too politically flammable right now to mention the religion, but it's out there. And you know, hell, I don't know, maybe they're right. Maybe Patrick Henry is a saint. I have no way of knowing. But I want to bring that down just with a few down-to-earth kind of humanizing comments. Justice Holmes wrote this. The Constitution The Constitution is an experiment, just like the rest of life, he wrote. In Catherine Bowen's book, The Story of the Constitutional Convention, she wrote, Americans were the first people in recorded history to bring forth a new nation, and the first two to found it upon a central body of principles, our Constitution. There's no making light of that, but 225 years ago now, in 1787, in a hot, sweltering summer in the city of Philadelphia, so hot and sweltering that it was difficult to stay indoors and more difficult to stay out. A summer in which concentration was difficult and meetings ended early. A summer in Philadelphia, the largest urban area in the United States at the time, which was, interestingly, the size of Butte today. That's the size of Philadelphia. Now that's Butte on a Wednesday night. As you know, when they have a lot of fun over there, the population literally triples. It did last summer, but in Philadelphia it could never match that. But delegates met in the city of Philadelphia in the what was then called the Pennsylvania State House. It's now known as the New Independence Hall. New Independence Hall. Then it was called the New Independence. Later it was called the New Independence Hall. Now you just know it as Independence Hall if you've been able to go back there. A bit about the delegates. They were young, really young. Most of them were in their 20s or 30s. Charles Pinckney was 29. Alexander Hamilton was 30. James Madison, who is friends back there, interestingly enough, called Jemmy, J-E-M-M-Y. Jemmy, not quite Jimmy, but Jemmy Madison, 30. The oldest, as you know, was Franklin. Old Ben was 81. He was ancient for those days. Now, 74 delegates, we always hear about 55 delegates. 74 delegates were chosen. A bunch of them just didn't bother to show up because they didn't know what the hell was going to go on there. Some of them couldn't get there, some of them didn't care. Some of them went and said, well, this isn't going anywhere, and they went back home. New ones had come, but they ended up with 55. We hear a lot about 55 delegates. John Adams was in London. He was elected. And Mr. Jefferson was in Paris. He too had been elected. As I say, others came and went, and there was a lot of frustration with a lot of very young people. Some of them just tipping away from boyhood, really, the early 20s. But bright, certainly bright. It was understandable that the delegates did not know they were each a piece of the Constitutional Convention because they hadn't been told they were a part of the Constitutional Convention. And it was not called the Constitutional Convention. The Congress, previous Congress that had met in New York City in early that February, the delegates started coming in May in Philadelphia, but in New York City early in February, the Congress sanctioned the Philadelphia meeting, quote, for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. The delegates struggled with uncertainty, struggled with language. They were all engaged in it, but in the end, as often happens, a handful wrote it. A handful wrote it. There was significant opposition to it, and like our own Constitution, it barely passed. There's always a few old soreheads out there. And then when it went to the people, excuse me, it barely was acceptable. Let me read you this short thing and then I'll conclude, provided I earmark the right piece. This is a letter from Jefferson. He was trying to help out. He was, as I've said, in Paris. And he wrote to a friend, "Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them, like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. Ah, I know that age well," said Jefferson. "I belonged to it." As we read the hallowed and for some holy words of our founders, brilliant words done by very smart people, we need to remember that thing about feet of clay and not be afraid to go back and reconsider. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pat. And thank you, Ken, and Humanities Montana for this opportunity. I think it was Delegate DeHood last night who said that the Con delegates, he made the observation that they're the most exclusive club in Montana. And damn it, I think he's right. I had kind of the banjo part in the Hallelujah chorus in terms of the Con because I was out of state in the Navy when the Con occurred. And then, of course, somewhere along the line, the decision was made that any sitting office holder couldn't serve as a delegate in the Con anyway, which I think in retrospect was actually a pretty good idea. There were some members of the CONCON who had served in public office before, including in the legislature, but none who were serving in the legislature at the time that the CONCON was elected could continue to serve. And I think it probably actually made things work better. As an example, the alphabetical seating is something that was so traditional in a legislative body that it would have probably been impossible for them to agree to. And yet, I think it helped in a major way to make the Constitutional Convention successful. And certainly it was. I know that it was mentioned, I think maybe by Maynard Ellington, that the Constitution contains 17 specific rights that aren't found in the old 1889 Constitution or in the U.S. Constitution. And that's pretty significant. You know, you probably heard the old saying that everybody's for reform, but nobody wants to change anything. Well, the Constitution changed a lot. And in a very significant and progressive and positive way. And then, of course, it ran the risk of not being confirmed. And when it was narrowly by the people, and only then upheld by a 3-2 decision in the state Supreme Court, I didn't remember until the discussion yesterday that it actually had to go through an appeals process through the federal court system. And the federal court, the U.S. Supreme Court, denied the final appeal. And that was something like a year or more later, after the Constitution had actually been confirmed by a somewhat controversial and perilously close vote of the people. And so you could say, well, maybe if the Constitutional Convention delegates had been more careful, maybe if they'd drawn a less progressive document, maybe if they'd drawn up a more politically careful document, if they wouldn't have had an easier chance of getting it passed. Well, perhaps. But then you have to ask yourself what we have in retrospect. I don't remember exactly where I found it, but a few years ago I was giving a talk on the Montana Constitution. And I contacted one of my old friends going back to my college years, Dorothy Eck from Bozeman. And she told me that the Montana Constitution was identified in some document as one of the 100 great documents in world history. Now that sounds pretty fantastic, but we tracked down that source and I was able to use that. So sometimes I think when you attempt great things and you accomplish them, the benefits are enormous. And perhaps that is an example of the Montana Constitution. I don't have any question, but what the Constitutional Convention was the most significant event in Montana history in the last century. I'm certain of that. So anyway, my hat's off to you as members of that exclusive club, and Montana was greatly fortunate to have the Constitution, which is now celebrating its 40th anniversary. And I think we should give a round of applause to the Constitution. As Pat mentioned, he and I discussed that he'd focus on the U.S. Constitution and I'd focus on the state constitution, because the purpose of the conference was that it would focus on constitutions, plural. And we've done some comparing and contrasting, but generally I think because this is the anniversary of the Montana State Constitution, we've got delegates from there here, and it'd be awful tough to come up with Ben Franklin and Madison and those guys.